I have $42, the 9-year-old boy whispered, sliding a crumpled pile of bills across the clinic counter. I want to hire you to be my mom. Just until my dad gets back from his Navy SEAL deployment. Rachel stared at the desperate child, completely stunned. But before she could answer, a deep, exhausted voice echoed from the doorway. It was his father. What started as a child's innocent $42 contract soon shattered a guarded military man's walls. But neither of them expected the boy's real mother to show up on deployment day, forcing the SEAL to make a choice that would leave the entire room speechless. The waiting room of the Oak Creek Community Clinic was empty. The fluorescent lights hummed a low, steady rhythm, signaling the end of another long Tuesday shift. Rachel adjusted her stethoscope around her neck and signed the last of her pediatric charts. "Excuse me." The voice was small but serious. Rachel looked up. Ben stood on the other side of the reception desk. He was 9 years old, wearing a faded baseball cap pulled low over his eyes, and his posture was entirely too stiff for a child. He didn't look like a boy waiting for a checkup. He looked like a man preparing for a business negotiation. Before Rachel could ask where his father was, Ben reached into his jacket pocket. He pulled out a crumpled pile of $1 bills, smoothed them flat with extreme care, and slid them across the counter. 3/4 followed, clinking softly against the laminate wood. Finally, he placed a piece of lined notebook paper next to the money. "I have $42, Ben said quietly. "And 3/4. But I get an allowance on Fridays, so the rest can be put on a payment plan." Rachel blinked, lowering her pen. She looked at the money, then at the notebook paper. It was covered in neat, penciled handwriting. At the top, in all capital letters, were the words, "Official Contract." "Ben," Rachel said, her voice softening. "What is this?" "It's a job offer," he replied, not breaking eye contact. "My dad is deploying for 6 months. He's going to send me to live with my great-aunt Carol in Ohio. Her house smells like mothballs, and she doesn't let me turn on the heat. I don't want to go." He pushed the notebook paper an inch closer to her. "I want to hire you to be my mom. Just until he gets back. I promise I clean my room." Rachel's breath caught in her throat. She stared at the child, her heart breaking at the sheer, desperate pragmatism in his eyes. "Ben. Ben." The second voice didn't come from Rachel. It came from the hallway. Rachel looked up. Carter stood in the doorway. He was still in his working uniform, his broad shoulders filling the frame of the door. He was a Navy SEAL team leader, a man trained to handle the most dangerous situations on Earth without flinching. But looking at his son's $42 on the clinic counter, Carter looked entirely, utterly defeated. Carter stepped fully into the clinic waiting room. His boots made no sound on the linoleum, a habit born of years of training, but his physical presence seemed to take up all the oxygen in the room. He didn't look angry. He looked entirely caught off guard. "Ben," Carter said. His voice was a low, measured baritone. It was the tone of a man used to giving orders in chaotic environments, now desperately trying to apply that same control to a 9-year-old boy. "What exactly are we doing here?" Ben didn't flinch. He just pointed to the notebook paper on the counter. "I'm solving the logistics problem, Dad, like you taught me." Carter closed his eyes for a brief second. A muscle feathered in his jaw. When he opened his eyes, he looked directly at Rachel. "I apologize, ma'am," he said, stepping toward the reception desk. He reached out to gather the crumpled dollar bills and the 3/4. He knows he isn't supposed to bother the clinic staff after hours. "He isn't bothering me," Rachel said quietly. She placed her hand flat on the counter, just inches from his, stopping him from pulling the notebook paper away. Carter looked at her hand, then up at her face. His eyes were a dark, stormy gray, framed by deep exhaustion. He was wearing the crisp uniform of a Navy SEAL, complete with the trident insignia on his chest, but right now, he just looked like a very tired single father trying to hold his world together. "I'm Rachel," she said. "I'm the community nurse. I took his blood pressure last week when he came in for his school physical." "Carter," he replied, his tone clipped but polite, "and I'm aware of the physical. He needs medical clearance for a temporary school transfer." "To Ohio," Rachel said, glancing down at the handwritten contract. With Great-Aunt Carol, Carter shifted his weight. The defensive walls practically materialized around him. "It's a temporary deployment. 6 months. My usual childcare arrangement fell through, and his mother isn't in the picture. Carol is family. It's safe. She turns off the Wi-Fi at 6 o'clock, Ben argued, crossing his arms. "And she told me boys who cry Go to military school. Carter stiffened. He looked down at his son. His expression caught somewhere between strict discipline and deep, unspoken guilt. Ben, we talked about this. It's a logistical necessity. I don't have another option right now. Yes, you do, Ben said stubbornly, tapping the $42. I just hired Rachel, Carter sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. He looked at the nurse, clearly expecting a polite, uncomfortable smile. He expected her to slide the money back across the counter and wish them a good evening so he could take his son home and pretend this never happened. Instead, Rachel picked up the contract. Rachel read the handwritten notebook paper. The terms were highly specific. Bedtime at 9. No smelling like mothballs. Allowed to ride his bicycle on weekends. She looked up at Carter. He stood rigidly, a man who could dismantle a weapon in the dark but was entirely paralyzed by a piece of notebook paper. I need to review his medical transfer paperwork before I can clear him for Ohio, Rachel said, folding the contract. I finish my shift at 5 tomorrow. I can bring the forms to your house. Carter frowned, his brow furrowing. That isn't standard clinic protocol. Neither is a 9-year-old trying to buy a mother, she replied smoothly. The next evening, Rachel stood in the foyer of Carter's home. It was exactly what she had expected, yet somehow much colder. The hardwood floors gleamed. The furniture was perfectly aligned. There was no clutter, no stray shoes, no mail on the counter, but there were also no photographs on the walls, no child's drawings on the refrigerator. It didn't look like a family lived there. It looked like a military staging area. Carter offered her a glass of water with stiff, practiced politeness. He wore a plain gray t-shirt that clung to his broad shoulders, looking entirely out of place in his own kitchen. You run a tight ship, Rachel noted, accepting the glass. Structure keeps things safe, he said quietly. Structure keeps things predictable, she corrected. But Ben doesn't need predictable right now. He needs to not lose the only home he knows. Carter's jaw tightened. I'm out of options. I deploy in 2 weeks. I have to do what makes sense. Rachel reached into her purse. She pulled out the crumpled $42 and placed it on the pristine granite counter. I can't take his money, she said. Carter exhaled, a heavy sigh of relief. I'll make sure he understands. Thank you for your time, Rachel. But, she interrupted, pulling out a typed document of her own. I will take the job. Carter froze. Professionally, Rachel clarified. I work 3 days a week at the clinic. I can be here when he gets off the school bus. I will stay in the guest room. We can draft a legal temporary guardianship agreement so I can make medical and school decisions while you are deployed. Carter stared at her, completely stunned. You don't even know us. Why would you do this? Because I know what it feels like to be sent away when you are suddenly an inconvenience, Rachel said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. I have the space in my life. Let me help him. Rachel moved into the guest room on a Sunday. She brought a suitcase, a stack of nursing textbooks, and an absolute refusal to tiptoe around Carter's rules. Carter had exactly 14 days left until his deployment. He intended to use that time to establish a strict, seamless transition. He drafted a printed schedule detailing Ben's school hours, meal prep times, and bedtime routines, placing it perfectly in the center of the kitchen island. By Tuesday evening, the schedule was covered in flour and mostly obscured by a massive bowl of rising pizza dough. Carter stood in the kitchen doorway, staring at the scene. His pristine granite countertops were a disaster zone. Ben was standing on a stool, his hands completely coated in flour, laughing loudly as Rachel showed him how to knead the dough. There was music playing, actual music spilling from a small radio Rachel had plugged in near the sink. You're overworking the dough, Chief, Rachel teased, bumping Ben's shoulder with her own. I'm executing a tactical kneading maneuver, Ben replied, a wide, genuine smile breaking across his usually serious face. Carter watched them from the shadows of the hall. His immediate instinct was to step in, to wipe down the counters, to restore order. His entire life as a SEAL was built on controlling his environment. Mess meant unpredictability. Unpredictability meant vulnerability. But as he shifted his weight to intervene, he stopped. Ben was laughing, a real breathless laugh that Carter hadn't heard in years. The tight, anxious posture his son had carried around for months was completely gone. Rachel looked up and caught Carter hovering in the doorway. She didn't apologize for the mess. She didn't scramble to clean it up to appease him. She just brushed a stray strand of hair out of her face with a flour-dusted wrist. Grab a grater, Carter, she said smoothly, not using his rank or a formal title. We need cheese. And your son claims you have superior upper body strength. Carter hesitated. The house smelled like garlic, warm yeast, and something else he hadn't felt in a long time. It felt alive. Slowly, the SEAL team leader walked into the bright kitchen and rolled up his sleeves. By the end of the first week, Carter realized he had a problem. As a SEAL, his primary asset was his ability to observe his environment, assess variables, and adapt. But lately, his highly trained observational skills were entirely focused on the woman staying in his guest room. It started with small details. He noticed she drank her coffee black, despite buying vanilla creamer for the house. He noticed the way she hummed a quiet, off-key tune when she was reviewing her clinic charts at the kitchen island. But mostly, he noticed how she was with Ben. On Thursday night, Carter stood in the darkened hallway, looking into his son's bedroom. A small lamp cast a warm, golden glow over the room. Rachel was sitting on the edge of the bed, holding a worn paperback book. She wasn't just reading to Ben, she was doing the voices, completely unbothered by how silly she sounded. Ben was propped up on his pillows, his eyes heavy, a soft, easy smile on his face. He looked so remarkably young. He didn't look like the rigid, anxious boy who had tried to buy a mother for $42. He just looked safe. Carter leaned against the door frame, a strange tightness gripping his chest. It was a sharp, sudden pang of envy. He was envious of how effortlessly she made his son smile a skill. Carter felt he had lost somewhere between his demanding deployments and his crushing responsibility. But as Rachel reached out, gently brushing a loose lock of hair from Ben's forehead, the tightness in Carter's chest shifted into something else. Something much more dangerous to a man who relied on absolute emotional control. He wasn't just watching a temporary guardian do her job. He was watching a beautiful woman care for the most important thing in his life. Rachel closed the book, whispered a quiet goodnight, and stood up. When she turned and stepped into the hallway, she nearly bumped directly into his chest. She gasped softly, taking a quick half-step back. Her eyes flicked up to his. The hallway was dark, the space between them suddenly feeling very narrow. "He's asleep," she whispered, her voice a little breathless. Carter looked down at her. "I know. I was watching." He hadn't meant for it to sound like a confession, but in the quiet dark of the hallway, it felt exactly like one. Carter rarely slept through the night. It was a lingering side effect of his deployments, a hypervigilance that refused to turn off. At 2 a.m, he walked quietly down the dark stairs to get a glass of water. He stopped when he saw the faint light spilling from the kitchen. Rachel was sitting at the island. She wasn't reviewing clinic charts. Her hands were folded tightly over a small, faded medical document, and her shoulders were trembling. She was crying, completely silently. Carter's protective instincts flared, but he didn't rush in. He stepped deliberately on the hardwood floor, making just enough noise to announce his presence so he wouldn't startle her. Rachel quickly wiped her face, trying to slide the paper under a nursing textbook. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice thick. "I thought you were asleep." Carter walked slowly into the kitchen. He didn't turn on the overhead lights. He poured 2 glasses of water, sliding one across the granite counter toward her. He glanced at the edge of the paper she was trying to hide. It bore the letterhead of a surgical oncology clinic. "You don't have to hide," Carter said quietly. His voice wasn't an order. It was a safe harbor. Rachel looked down at her hands, her defenses crumbling under his quiet patience. "It's been exactly 3 years," she said, the words slipping out before she could stop them. "Since the surgery. It was a severe complication. They had to take everything." She swallowed hard. "I spend all day taking care of children, Carter. But I'll never have my own. When Ben offered me that $42 to be his mom, it just broke something open. Most men would have offered an awkward apology. They would have offered pity, or told her that things happen for a reason. Carter did none of that. He understood irreversible loss. He stepped around the kitchen island. He didn't pull her into a dramatic embrace. Instead, he placed his large, calloused hand gently over her trembling ones. "He's a smart kid," Carter said, his voice a low, steady rumble. "He picked the right woman." The night before Carter was scheduled to deploy, the house felt entirely different than it had 2 weeks ago. It wasn't just quiet. It was peaceful. Carter stood on the back porch, looking out at the dark yard. His gear was packed and sitting by the front door. He was leaving at 0600. For the past 4 years, the night before a deployment had been a suffocating exercise in anxiety, calculating every possible thing that could go wrong with Ben while he was gone. Tonight, his chest felt strangely light, and that terrified him more than any combat zone. The screen door creaked open. Rachel stepped onto the porch. She was wearing an oversized knit sweater, her arms crossed against the evening chill. "He's finally asleep," she said softly, leaning against the wooden railing next to him. "He made me promise to wake him up before you leave. Even if it's early." Carter looked at her. The pale moonlight caught the soft curve of her jaw and the quiet strength in her eyes. "Thank you, Rachel, for all of this. I don't just mean the paperwork. I know what you mean," she replied, holding his gaze. The air between them suddenly felt very heavy. The professional boundary they had so carefully constructed over the past 2 weeks was gone, dissolved by shared dinners, quiet kitchen conversations, and the mutual understanding of unseen wounds. Carter took a step closer. He didn't think about it. It was a pure, magnetic pull. He reached out, his rough knuckles grazing the soft wool of her sweater before his hand gently cupped the side of her face. Rachel's breath hitched. She didn't pull away. She leaned slightly into his touch, her eyes fluttering shut for a fraction of a second. Carter lowered his head. He was inches away. He could feel the warmth of her breath. He wanted, more than anything, to close the distance. But the heavy weight of his reality crashed down on him. He was leaving in 8 hours. He was a man who lived in dangerous places. It wasn't fair to ask her to wait or to worry or to care for him when she was already caring for his son. Carter's jaw clenched. Slowly, painfully, he pulled his hand back. "I have an early morning," he whispered, his voice rough and completely devoid of its usual steady command. Without looking back, Carter walked into the house, leaving Rachel standing alone in the cold. At 0545 hours, Carter's heavy duffel bag sat by the front door. The morning was cold and gray. Rachel stood in the kitchen, holding a warm mug of coffee. The unspoken weight of last night's near kiss still hung heavy in the quiet space between them. Carter checked his watch. He had 15 minutes before his military transport arrived. He looked at Rachel, his expression guarded, clearly searching for the right words to say goodbye. He never got the chance to say them. Headlights swept across the front windows, followed by the sound of tires crunching aggressively on the driveway. Carter frowned. His transport wasn't due yet. When the knock came, it was sharp and demanding. Carter opened the door. The cold morning air rushed into the warm house, but the real chill came from the woman standing on the porch. It was Jessica, his ex-wife. She was flanked by a man in a sharp gray suit carrying a leather briefcase. Carter's entire body went rigid. His SEAL instincts kicked in instantly, his broad shoulders shifting to completely block the doorway. "What are you doing here, Jessica? You haven't called in 4 years. I heard through the grapevine that you're deploying today," she said smoothly, her eyes darting past him to scan the interior of the house. "I'm not letting my son be shipped off to Ohio, and I'm certainly not letting him be left with strangers. I'm here to take Ben." "You don't have a home with him," Carter said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, icy low. "I have primary custody." The man in the suit stepped forward. "I am Miss Miller's attorney. Given your imminent departure out of the country and your inability to provide direct parental care, my client is asserting her maternal right to assume temporary physical custody, for which she will, of course, require the appropriate child support stipend." Jessica finally noticed Rachel standing near the kitchen island. She looked Rachel up and down, her lips curling into a dismissive smirk. "And who is this?" Jessica asked, her tone dripping with condescension. "The hired help?" "Let's get one thing straight, Carter. A paid babysitter does not supersede a mother's legal rights." The lawyer opened his briefcase, pulling out a thick stack of documents. "Under state family law, Mr. Miller," the attorney said smoothly, "a temporary guardianship contract granted to a non-relative employee holds no legal weight when the biological mother is present and willing to assume physical custody during your overseas deployment." Carter stared at the paperwork. His tactical mind, usually so sharp in a crisis, hit a wall. He had exactly 10 minutes before his military transport arrived. He didn't have time to call his own lawyer. He didn't have time to file an emergency injunction. Jessica knew exactly what she was doing. She had timed this ambush perfectly. "If you leave the country today, with this nurse in charge of Ben," the lawyer continued, "my client will return with the police and a court order to remove the child from the premises. It will be highly traumatic for the boy and highly damaging to your primary custody status when you return." Jessica crossed her arms, a triumphant smile playing on her lips. "I'll take his bags now, Carter." Carter's chest tightened. He looked at the documents, then at Jessica, and finally at Rachel. Rachel was standing by the kitchen island, her face pale but her posture straight. She looked like a woman bracing for a physical blow. Carter's deepest, most ingrained instinct flared to life. Protect. Isolate the threat. Minimize the collateral damage. He could not let Jessica drag Rachel into a vicious, ugly legal battle. He couldn't let Rachel's professional nursing license or her quiet, peaceful life be destroyed by his broken past. He had to cut the tie to keep her safe. Carter took a step back, his face hardening into an unreadable military mask. The warmth from the night before vanished instantly. "Rachel," Carter said, his voice clipped and hollow. "Go pack your things." Rachel flinched. "Carter, wait! This is a family legal matter," he interrupted, refusing to meet her eyes because he knew if he did, he would break. "The contract is void. This isn't your fight. You need to leave." Rachel didn't move. She didn't flinch. She just looked at Carter, her eyes completely steady. "No," she said. The single word hung in the air. Jessica rolled her eyes, but Carter looked genuinely shocked. In his military world, an order was an order. "Rachel," Carter warned, his voice tight. "You don't understand what this lawyer can do. I am not letting you get dragged into family court over my past." "You don't get to decide what I can handle, Carter," Rachel interrupted, her voice rising with quiet, fierce authority. "You do this every time. The second things get complicated or messy, you lock the door. You think pushing people away is how you protect them. But you aren't protecting Ben right now. You're just surrendering. I am his father," Carter snapped, the frustration and fear finally breaking through his composed exterior. "I am trying to keep him safe." "Then fight for him!" she fired back. "Fight for us." The word times us times echoed in the sudden silence of the kitchen. Before Carter could process it, a small, frantic set of footsteps hurried down the wooden stairs. Ben appeared in the hallway. He was wearing his pajamas, his face pale and wide awake. He didn't look at his mother, who was standing by the door. He didn't look at the lawyer. He ran straight past Carter and buried his face in Rachel's side. Rachel immediately dropped to her knees, wrapping her arms tightly around the boy. Ben was shaking. "Don't go," Ben sobbed into her sweater, his small hands gripping the fabric. "Please, Rachel, don't let her take me." Jessica stepped forward, her face flushing with indignant anger. "Ben, let go of that woman right now. We are leaving." Ben just held on tighter. Carter stood frozen. He looked at his son, terrified and clinging to the nurse he had tried to hire for $42. And then he looked at Rachel. She was holding his son with the fierce, unyielding protection of a real mother, glaring up at Jessica without a shred of fear. The walls Carter had spent 4 years building finally shattered. He realized Rachel was right. He didn't need to push the world away to keep his family safe. He just needed to stand his ground with the people who mattered. Carter squared his shoulders and turned back to the lawyer. Carter looked at the attorney, his posture shifting entirely. The rigid, defensive stance of a man trying to survive a crisis vanished. He stood tall, the absolute authority of a SEAL team leader returning to his frame. But this time, it wasn't used to push people away. "My deployment status has just changed," Carter stated, his voice ringing with icy certainty. The lawyer frowned, adjusting his briefcase. "Excuse me? You can't just—" Carter ignored him. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and dialed a number. He put it on speaker and set it on the granite counter. "Commander," Carter said when the line connected. "It's Miller. I'm formally withdrawing from today's deployment roster. I am accepting the open instructor billet at the training command, effective immediately." There was a brief pause on the line before a gruff voice replied, "Understood, Chief. Take care of your family. We'll process the transfer." Carter ended the call. He looked back at Jessica, whose smug expression had completely evaporated. "I will not be out of the country," Carter said quietly. "I will be stationed exactly 4 miles from this house, every single day." He walked slowly across the kitchen to where Rachel was still kneeling on the floor, holding his trembling son. Carter crouched down beside them. He placed one large, calloused hand on Ben's back, calming the boy's shaking. Then, deliberately and gently, his other hand covered Rachel's. He looked up at his ex-wife. "And you're right about one thing, Jessica. Rachel isn't a hired babysitter." Rachel turned her head, her breath catching as Carter looked directly into her eyes. There was no hesitation left in him. The walls he had spent 4 years building were entirely, irrevocably gone. "She is my partner," Carter said, the word heavy and solid with truth. "She is the woman I love, and she is the only mother Ben recognizes. If you want to take me to family court to challenge my custody while I am stationed at home, building a life with my future wife, you can try, but you will lose. The front door clicked shut. The engine of Jessica's car revved and faded down the street. The silence that followed inside the house wasn't heavy or tense. It was the sound of a storm finally breaking. Rachel slowly stood up, her knees slightly shaky. Ben kept his arms wrapped securely around her waist. "Did you mean it?" Rachel whispered, searching Carter's face. Her voice was guarded, protecting her own fragile hope. Or was that just a tactical maneuver to get them out of the house? Carter stepped closer. He reached down, gently untangling Ben's arms and giving his son a reassuring squeeze on the shoulder. "Go put your shoes on, buddy. We're not going to the base today. We're going to get pancakes." Ben beamed, wiping his eyes, and sprinted up the stairs. Carter turned back to Rachel. He closed the remaining distance between them, his hands coming up to gently cup her face. The exhaustion that usually shadowed his eyes was completely gone, replaced by a deep, anchoring peace. "I have never meant anything more in my entire life," he murmured. When he kissed her, it wasn't hesitant, and it wasn't rushed. It was a promise. It was the profound relief of a man who had finally stopped running and realized he was already home. Rachel kissed him back, her hands sliding up to grip his shoulders, holding on fiercely to the family she had always believed she would never have. Upstairs in his bedroom, Ben stood by his dresser. He opened a small wooden keepsake box. He didn't pack a suitcase for Ohio. Instead, he carefully took out a crumpled pile of $42 bills and 3 shiny quarters. He placed the money gently into the bottom of the box and closed the lid with a satisfied click. He didn't need to spend it. The contract was already signed.